My name is Margaret, though not many people call me that anymore. Most just say Grandma, and in the beginning that used to be enough for me. I was born and raised in a small town in Nebraska where everyone knew each other and families lived close by. I remember when I was a little girl, my grandmother's house was the heart of our family. No matter how busy our lives got, we all knew her name, her laugh, the smell of her kitchen, and the way her hands felt when they rested on our shoulders. Back then, family meant more than blood. It meant memory, recognition, and respect. I thought when I became a grandmother, it would be the same for me. I thought I'd be cherished the way we cherished her. But I was wrong. When my children grew up and moved away, I knew life would change, but I never imagined how much. They went to bigger cities in Nebraska, some even farther out of state, chasing careers, chasing opportunities that our quiet town couldn't offer. I didn't complain. I wanted them to have better lives. I encouraged them. I packed their lunches, hugged them, and told them they could reach the stars. What I didn't realize then was that in helping them leave, I was also building the walls of my own loneliness. The first time I became a grandmother, I thought my heart would burst with joy. I held that tiny baby in my arms and whispered my name softly. I'm Margaret, your grandma, and I love you more than you'll ever know. My son smiled at me, but I could see the distance already in his eyes. They lived 2 hours away, and visits were rare. Months passed, and when I saw my grandchild again, he didn't recognize me. He hid behind his mother's legs, peeking out with shy eyes, as if I were a stranger. I told myself it was normal, just part of being little, but it stung all the same. As more grandchildren came, I thought things would get better. I thought the older ones would remember me, teach the younger ones my name, and keep me alive in their hearts. But instead, each new visit became harder. I would kneel down, open my arms, and say, "Come here, it's Grandma!" But they would look at me with confusion, as if trying to place who I was. Some called me the lady from the farm. Others didn't call me anything at all. Once, one of them asked my daughter-in-law, "What's her name again?" My chest ached when she whispered back, "That's your grandma." It wasn't just the children, it was the grown-ups too. My own children seemed to forget that I was more than just a babysitter when it suited them. They didn't call often, and when they did, it was rushed. Holidays became short visits, where they arrived with tired faces, scrolled on their phones, and left quickly after the meal. I would sit at the table, clearing dishes, watching my grandchildren run around the living room, none of them calling out my name, none of them knowing me the way I wanted to be known. There's a special kind of pain in being alive and invisible at the same time. You smile, you serve food, you listen, and you nod, but inside you feel the hollowness growing. I had spent decades of my life giving, raising children, working hard, keeping a home, making sure everyone was cared for. I thought that in my older years I would have that love returned, if not in abundance, at least in recognition. But what I got was silence. Silence when they saw me. Silence when they forgot to call. Silence when my name slipped from their memory. One evening, after everyone left, I sat alone in my chair. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears. I looked at the framed pictures on the wall. Weddings, birthdays, Christmas mornings. My face was there in every one, smiling, holding a baby, standing beside my children. But in the present moment, I didn't exist in their world. I was a photograph, not a person. I remember whispering to myself, "They don't even know my name." and the truth of it cut deeper than any knife could. I tried to change things. I tried baking cookies and mailing them, sending cards with my name signed in bold letters, calling more often, leaving cheerful messages on their phones. But most of the time, the cookies went uneaten, the cards unanswered, the calls never returned. My efforts seemed like drops in a well that had no bottom. I began to wonder if it was me, if I had failed somewhere as a mother, if I hadn't loved enough, or maybe loved too much. One day at the grocery store, I ran into an old friend. She asked me about my grandchildren, and I forced a smile, telling her how big they were getting, how smart they were in school. She laughed and said, "I bet they can't stop saying your name all the time." I nodded, but inside I wanted to cry. The truth was they didn't say it at all. That night I prayed. I prayed for strength, for peace, for some kind of answer. I asked God why my family had grown away from me, why my own grandchildren didn't know my name. I didn't get an answer right then, but I felt a whisper inside me. You are still here. You still matter. Even if they forget, I never will. And so I began this story, because if my own family won't remember me, maybe my words will. Maybe someone somewhere will hear my voice and know that there was once a woman in Nebraska named Margaret who loved her children, who loved her grandchildren, even when they didn't know her name. When I look back, I realize the distance didn't just happen overnight. It was built little by little, like bricks stacking up silently until one day you wake up and find there's a wall so high you can't even see over it anymore. I told myself in the early years that it was just life. Everyone is busy, everyone has jobs, kids have sports, families have responsibilities. But deep down, I knew there was something else too, something that kept me on the outside of my own family circle. It started with visits that grew shorter. At first, when my children had little babies, they came home often. I would cook for them, rock the babies to sleep, and feel like a part of their world. My arms were full, my heart was full, and for a short time I felt like I mattered. But as the children grew, those visits stopped. My house was too small, too old-fashioned, too far from the excitement of the city. Instead of coming to me, they wanted me to come to them. And when I did, I noticed things had changed. I sat in their living rooms, surrounded by toys I hadn't bought, photos on the walls that didn't include me, and routines that no longer had space for Grandma. When I spoke, sometimes no one listened. My stories about Nebraska winters or how I used to can vegetables seemed boring to them. They were too busy talking about new jobs, new gadgets, and vacations I was never invited on. I felt like a guest in their homes, not a mother or grandmother. The hardest part was with the grandchildren themselves. I would sit on the couch and pat the cushion beside me, but none of them came to sit. They preferred their tablets or their games, and when I tried to join in, I didn't know how. I didn't understand their devices, the new songs they liked, or the cartoons they watched. I thought maybe if I baked cookies or told them old stories, I could reach them. But they would take a cookie, nod politely, and run off again. They didn't ask me questions. They didn't even try to learn my name. One day, I was at my daughter's house when one of her friends came over. The little boy she brought along asked my granddaughter, "Who's that lady?" My granddaughter shrugged and said, "I think that's my dad's mom." My heart sank. I wanted her to say, "That's my Grandma Margaret." I wanted her to say it proudly, the way I used to say my grandmother's name. But instead, she said it like I was a stranger passing through. It made me think about when I was young. My grandmother's name was Clara. I said it all the time. When I skinned my knee, I cried, "Grandma Clara!" When I was hungry, I ran to her kitchen and said, "Grandma Clara, what's for dinner?" She was a name, a presence, a heartbeat in my life. She wasn't just the lady from the farm. She was everything. And now here I was in the same role, but without the same love. I started to notice how my children talked to me too. They didn't call me Mom as often as they used to. Sometimes when they wanted my help, they just said, "Hey." Other times, they'd introduce me vaguely to friends, saying, "This is my mother," without even using my name. It was as if Margaret had disappeared into the shadows, and only the mother or the grandma was left. Titles without meaning, roles without recognition. I tried to fight back in my own way. I began writing letters. Each one I signed, "Love, Grandma Margaret." I wanted those two words, Grandma and Margaret, to stay in their memories. I wanted them to know that I was more than a shadowy figure. But most of those letters never got a reply. Sometimes weeks went by before I even knew if they had been read. My name was there on the paper, but it didn't seem to matter. One Christmas, I thought I'd make something special. I spent weeks knitting scarves for each grandchild, carefully picking colors they liked. I wrapped each one with a tag that said, "Made with love by Grandma Margaret." I thought when they opened them, maybe they would finally look at me and say my name. But when the day came, they tore through the paper, glanced at the scarves, and tossed them aside for their new toys. Not a single one said my name. Not one. That night, I sat in bed holding back tears. I told myself not to expect too much from children, but it wasn't just about them. It was about the pattern that had grown in my family. My children were not teaching their children who I was. They weren't telling them stories about me or making me important in their lives. They let me fade into the background. And children, well, they learn what they're taught. If their parents don't value me, why should they? It was then that I realized something painful. Love, no matter how much you pour out, doesn't always return the way you expect. I had given everything, my time, my energy, my heart, and still my own grandchildren didn't know my name. But even in that pain, a small spark of determination lit inside me. I thought about my grandmother Clara again. I remembered how strong she was, how she never let loneliness take her dignity. Maybe that was my path too. Maybe I couldn't make my grandchildren say my name, but I could still honor it myself. I could still tell my story, keep my name alive in my own way. And so I made a choice. I would not give up, even if they forgot me. I would not let Margaret disappear. I would hold on to my identity, my memories, my love, because names matter. They carry our history, our worth, our very souls. And if my family couldn't remember mine, then I would make sure the world did. There are certain moments in life that carve themselves into your memory so deeply that no matter how many years pass, they feel as fresh as yesterday. For me, those moments often came in the form of small, ordinary interactions with my grandchildren, interactions that should have filled my heart with joy, but instead left me quietly broken. I remember one summer afternoon when my son brought his children to visit. I had prepared everything with care. I baked pies, roasted chicken, and set the table with the good dishes I only used for holidays. I wanted them to feel special. I wanted them to know that when they came to Grandma's house, it was a place of warmth and love. When they arrived, the children ran straight past me, their eyes lighting up not at the sight of me, but at the old swing set in the yard. They didn't even stop to say hello. I stood at the doorway, my arms halfway outstretched, waiting for a hug that never came. My son gave me a distracted kiss on the cheek, already busy unloading bags from the car. I swallowed my disappointment, pasted on a smile, and told myself, at least they're here. Later, as we sat down for dinner, One of my grandsons looked at me with curious eyes and asked, "What should I call you again?" His little voice was innocent, but the question sliced through me like a blade. I tried to keep my tone cheerful as I said, "You can call me Grandma. My name is Margaret." He nodded, then turned back to his plate without repeating it. Just like that, my name disappeared into the air. My son chuckled awkwardly and changed the subject. But inside me, something crumbled. That was supposed to be my family, my blood, my legacy, and yet I was a stranger at my own table. Another time, I went to a school recital for one of my granddaughters. She was going to be in the choir, and I was so proud. I drove nearly 3 hours to be there, bringing flowers and a camera, eager to see her shine. When the performance ended, families crowded around the children, hugging them, taking pictures. I finally reached her, holding out the flowers. She looked at me with confusion before forcing a polite smile. She didn't hug me. She didn't shout, "Grandma," the way other children did when they saw their grandparents. Instead, she said softly, "Thank you, ma'am." Ma'am. Not Grandma. Not Margaret. Just a polite word you use for strangers. I forced a smile, gave her the flowers, and told her how wonderful she was. But when I got back to my car, I cried. I sat there in the parking lot, clutching the steering wheel, trying to understand how I had gone from being the center of my children's world to being just ma'am in my grandchildren's eyes. It wasn't only the children, though. My own kids made mistakes that deepened the hurt. One Thanksgiving, my daughter invited her in-laws and their extended family. I was happy to come, even though I knew I'd feel out of place among people who weren't really my family. When I arrived, the room was buzzing with voices, laughter, and greetings. Her mother-in-law walked in, and immediately the grandchildren ran to her shouting, "Grandma! Grandma!" They hugged her tightly, their voices filled with love. I stood nearby, smiling weakly, hoping one of them might come to me too. None of them did. I was invisible in a crowd that should have been my own. I told myself it wasn't the children's fault. They were only doing what they were taught. My daughter and son-in-law made sure the children knew her mother's name, knew her role, knew her importance. But when it came to me, there was silence. No stories, no reminders, no effort to keep me alive in their daily lives. Children learn who to love by how they see their parents love. And if my name wasn't spoken in their home, how could I expect my grandchildren to know it? One of the most painful memories happened on my birthday. I don't ask for much, never have. I don't need expensive gifts or grand celebrations. Just a call, a card, a few words to let me know I'm remembered. That year I waited all day. The phone didn't ring. I checked it a dozen times, thinking maybe I'd missed a call. Nothing. As the sun went down, I baked myself a small cake. I lit a single candle, sat at the kitchen table and whispered, "Happy birthday, Margaret." I blew out the candle alone, tears slipping down my cheeks. My grandchildren didn't call because they didn't even know it was my birthday. They didn't even know my name. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake in how I raised my children. Maybe I had taught them to be independent too well. Maybe I had always said yes when they asked me to help, but never demanded anything in return. I thought love was enough, that my presence would always be valued. But now, as the years stretched on, I realized love unspoken becomes invisible. And invisible is exactly how I felt. Sometimes, late at night, I walk through my home looking at the photos on the walls. There I was, holding newborn babies standing beside birthday cakes, hugging children on Christmas morning. In those frozen moments, I existed. But in the present, it felt like I was fading. I would trace my name on the back of old photographs, whispering it like a prayer. "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret, as if saying it to myself was the only way to keep it alive. Yet, even in those painful times, I never stopped loving them. That's the cruel irony of it all. A grandmother's love doesn't vanish just because it isn't returned. My heart still leapt when I saw their faces, even if they didn't know mine. My arms still longed to hold them, even if they pulled away. I loved them silently, fiercely, endlessly, because that's what grandmothers do. And somewhere inside me, I began to believe that maybe one day something would change. Maybe they'd grow older, wiser, and realize who I was. Maybe they'd stumble across an old letter or a photograph and whisper, "That's Grandma Margaret." Until then, I carried both the hope and the hurt. The hope that they might someday know me, and the hurt of knowing they didn't yet. I often think that love is like planting seeds. You drop them into the soil with hope, water them with care, and wait for them to grow. But sometimes, no matter how much you nurture them, the ground stays barren. That's how I felt when I tried to bridge the distance between me and my grandchildren. I kept planting seeds, little acts of love, little reminders of who I was, praying that one day they'd take root in their hearts. One of the first things I did was start writing letters. Not just ordinary notes, but thoughtful, handwritten letters where I told them stories about my childhood, about life in Nebraska when I was their age, about the little adventures and hardships that shaped me. I wanted them to know my voice on paper, to know that Margaret wasn't just a name, but a woman with a life full of memories. At the bottom of every letter, I signed it the same way, "With all my love, Grandma Margaret." Sometimes I added little drawings or stickers, hoping to make the letters fun. Sometimes I tucked in a dollar bill or a pressed flower from my garden. I imagined them opening the envelopes with excitement, smiling as they saw my name, but most of the time I never heard back. My children would mention offhandedly that the kids got the letters, but they never told me what the children thought of them. Over time, I began to wonder if those envelopes ended up in drawers or worse, in the trash. Still, I kept writing, because I refused to let silence erase me. I also tried baking. Baking was always my way of showing love. My grandmother Clara taught me that the kitchen was a place where hearts could be mended. I baked cookies shaped like stars and hearts, banana bread wrapped in wax paper, and jars of homemade jam sealed tight with ribbons. I mailed them to the kids, imagining their faces lighting up when they tasted something made by their grandma's hands. But my daughter once told me, "Oh, they didn't really eat much of it. They're picky." My heart sank. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the love baked into every bite. When it was left uneaten, it felt like my love was being left uneaten too. Birthdays became another chance for me to reach out. I sent cards carefully chosen for each child. I made sure their names were written in bold letters, and then I'd sign mine just as proudly, from Grandma Margaret. I wanted them to remember the connection between their names and mine. But too often, my cards were met with silence. No thank you notes, no phone calls. Sometimes I didn't even know if they opened them. I began to wonder if my name, written in ink, was disappearing into the same silence I lived with daily. One summer, I decided to host a grandma's camp at my house. I invited the kids to spend a week with me in Nebraska. I planned everything, fishing at the creek, baking pies, telling stories by lantern light, teaching them how to plant tomatoes and watch them grow. I wanted them to know me not as a stranger, but as a part of their lives, a part of their childhood memories. But when I suggested it to their parents, they hesitated. "They're too busy with sports and activities," they said. "Maybe next year." Next year never came. The camp I dreamed of remained only that, a dream. Still, I kept trying. When I visited their homes, I brought photo albums, hoping to share family history. I pointed to old pictures of their father and mother as children, telling funny stories about the past. I thought maybe if they saw me woven into those memories, they would begin to see me differently. Sometimes they listened politely, but other times they drifted away uninterested. I learned that photographs alone cannot build bridges when no one teaches children why they matter. There was one moment, though, that gave me a glimmer of hope. My youngest granddaughter once came to stay with me for a weekend when her parents had a trip. She was small, barely 5 years old. At first she was shy, keeping her distance, but as the days passed, she started following me around the house. She watched as I kneaded bread, as I watered the garden, as I folded laundry. On the second night, she asked me, "What's your name again?" My heart trembled, but I answered gently, "My name is Margaret, but you can call me Grandma." The next morning, as I poured her cereal, she looked up at me and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." It was so soft I almost missed it, but those 2 words lit a fire inside me. For that moment I was seen. I was named. I was loved. When she went back home, I thought maybe she would carry that memory with her. Maybe she would tell her siblings. But weeks passed, and when I saw her again, she had slipped back into silence. My name had vanished once more. That fleeting spark showed me how fragile memory can be. Children's hearts are like sponges, but what they soak up depends on what they're surrounded by. And if my children weren't reminding them, then my little efforts alone weren't enough to make me stick. I also tried leaning on faith. I joined the church choir again, not just for my own sake, but because I thought maybe if my grandchildren saw me singing, they would see me as more than just the lady in the corner. One Easter, I invited them to the service. They came dressed in their Sunday clothes. I sang with all my heart, imagining that my voice carried my name in every note. Afterward, I asked my grandson if he liked the music. He shrugged and said it was okay. Then he ran off to play. I smiled and let him go, but inside I wished he had looked at me and said, "Grandma, you sang beautifully." Through all these attempts, one truth became clearer each day. I could not force my family to remember me. I could not plant myself in their hearts if they chose not to water the seed. But still I kept trying, not because I thought I'd succeed, but because love doesn't know how to quit. Every night I knelt by my bed and prayed. I asked God to whisper my name into their dreams, to remind them of who I was. I asked Him to give me strength to keep loving, even when it felt like loving shadows. And most of all, I asked Him to help me forgive, not just them, but myself for feeling so invisible. Because deep down I knew this, whether they spoke my name or not, I was still Margaret. I was still their grandmother, and I still loved them, even if they didn't know how to love me back. As the years went by, I realized I had a choice to make. I could either let the sadness of being forgotten consume me, or I could learn to carry it differently. The hurt never left. I doubt it ever will. But I began to understand that sometimes when family doesn't give you what you long for, you must find strength in other places. And strangely enough, I began to find pieces of that strength in the unlikeliest corners of my life. My church was one of those places. I had been a member for decades, singing in the choir, attending Bible study, and baking pies for fundraisers. For a long time, I drifted away from it, mostly because I was waiting on my family to fill the empty spaces in my heart. But one Sunday, when the loneliness became too heavy, I decided to go back. As soon as I stepped inside, I was met with smiles and warm greetings. "Good morning, Margaret," people said as if my name mattered, as if my presence was truly seen. It may sound small, but to me, it was like water on parched ground. At church, People didn't call me the lady from the farm or Mom without a name. They called me Margaret. They remembered me. They asked about me. They prayed for me. I began to realize that while my grandchildren didn't know my name, others did. And maybe I had been so focused on what I lacked that I'd forgotten to be grateful for what I still had. My neighbors, too, became a quiet blessing. There's a young family who moved in next door, 2 parents with little children who play outside all summer long. One day, I baked cookies and carried them over, the way my grandmother Clara used to do when new people arrived in her neighborhood. The children's eyes lit up at the sight of the cookies, and when their mother introduced me, she said, "This is Miss Margaret." The children repeated it right there, "Miss Margaret." And I felt a warmth spread through me. They knew my name after only one meeting, something my own grandchildren struggled to remember. Those neighbor kids began visiting me often. They'd wander over to my porch to play with my cats or sip lemonade I poured into little cups. They didn't call me Grandma, of course. They had their own grandmother. But they knew my name. They shouted it when they waved from across the yard. And though they weren't my blood, in those moments I felt less invisible. I also found strength in small acts of kindness that came back to me in unexpected ways. Once, I baked bread and left it on a widow's porch down the road, with a little note signed from Margaret. A few days later, she knocked on my door with tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you, Margaret. You reminded me I'm not alone." In her gratitude, I heard my own longing echoed back. We may not have been family, but we became something like it. 2 women holding each other up in the silence of being overlooked. It was during these little exchanges that I started to understand something important. Family is not only about blood. Family can be anyone who says your name with love, anyone who sees you, anyone who remembers you. My heart still longed for my grandchildren's recognition, but I began to steady myself with the knowledge that I mattered to others too. And in the quiet of my own home, I found strength in myself. I began keeping a journal, not just a diary of events, but a record of who I was. I wrote down my childhood memories, the recipes my grandmother taught me, the lessons I'd learned in life. I signed every entry with my name, Margaret. It was a way of reminding myself that even if the world forgot me, I wouldn't forget myself. Sometimes I would sit on the porch at dusk, watching the Nebraska sky turn shades of pink and gold, and I'd whisper my name into the open air. "Margaret!" I'd say softly, as if the land itself could carry it into eternity. It may sound strange, but it gave me peace. My name was mine, even if no one else spoke it. But even as I grew stronger in these unexpected ways, the longing for my grandchildren never left. At night, I still dreamed of them running into my arms, calling out, "Grandma Margaret!" with joy. I still prayed for the day when one of them might look me in the eye and say my name without being prompted. Hope is stubborn like that. It refuses to die, even when it's bruised and weary. There was one Sunday after church when a friend said to me, "Margaret, you shine when you talk about your grandchildren, even though they don't see you the way you deserve. Don't ever stop loving them. Love has a way of circling back when you least expect it." Her words stuck with me. Maybe she was right. Maybe my love would circle back. Maybe one day when the children were older, when life slowed down, they would look for the pieces of me I had left behind, my letters, my recipes, my photographs, and they would finally know who I was. Until then, I chose to live with dignity. I chose to keep giving, even if it wasn't returned. I chose to believe that my worth wasn't tied to whether or not they spoke my name. My worth was in the love I carried, in the stories I told, in the prayers I whispered for them each night. And so, while my heart still ached, I learned to steady myself on the shoulders of church friends, kind neighbors, and my own unshakable spirit. I was still Margaret. I was still here. And though my grandchildren didn't know my name, I refused to let it be erased. As the seasons turned and the years slipped by, I began to feel the weight of age settle into my bones. My steps grew slower, my hands less steady, and the mirror showed me a face lined with the stories of a lifetime. Growing old is not something you can truly prepare for, no matter how many birthdays you've lived through. It sneaks up quietly, and with it comes a deeper fear than any ache or pain. The fear of being forgotten. That fear haunted me more than anything else. Not the creaks in my knees or the dimming of my eyesight, but the thought that one day, when I am gone, my grandchildren might never even remember my name. That they might look at a family tree and see Margaret written there without any memory attached to it. That they might walk past an old photograph of me and think, who is she again? It is a heavy thing to wonder if your existence will fade like chalk washed away by the rain. I often thought of my grandmother Clara in those moments. Even now, decades after her passing, I can still see her face, hear her laugh, smell the cinnamon bread she used to bake. She was more than a name on paper. She was alive in my heart because she made sure her presence mattered. And I realized I needed to do the same. If my family wasn't carrying my name, then I had to carry it myself and leave it behind in ways they could not ignore. So I began leaving little pieces of myself scattered like breadcrumbs for them to find someday. I filled notebooks with stories from my childhood, the harsh winters of Nebraska, the nights huddled by a wood stove, the joy of running through golden cornfields in summer. I wrote about how I met their grandfather, how he struggled and how he loved, and how he built a life from very little. I wrote not just facts, but feelings, because I wanted them to know me not as a shadow, but as a woman of flesh and blood, with a beating heart that had always longed for them. I started gathering recipes too, ones passed down from my mother and grandmother, and wrote them in a binder in my careful handwriting. Beside each recipe, I added a little note. This was your father's favorite when he was a boy, or I baked this pie every Christmas for your mother. I hoped that one day, when they flipped through those pages, they would not just taste the food, but taste the love I had for them. I signed every page the same way. Love, Grandma Margaret. I even began labeling photographs. I pulled out the dusty albums from the shelves and went through them one by one. Beneath each picture, I wrote names, dates, places, and a little story. I wanted to make sure that when someone found them years from now, they wouldn't just see faces. They would see people, moments, and meaning. And on every page, I included myself. I wrote, "This is me, Margaret, your grandmother. I was there. I loved you." Still, the fear never fully left me. At night, when the house was quiet, I sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling, whispering my name into the darkness. "Margaret," I would say, as if reminding the world that I was still here. There is something haunting about silence when you realize no one is speaking your name out loud. It is like being erased before you are even gone. One Sunday, the pastor preached about legacy, how the lives we live ripple beyond us, touching generations we may never see. His words struck me deeply. I ask myself, what is my legacy? If my grandchildren do not know my name now, will they ever? Or will my legacy vanish when my breath does? That question pressed on me like a weight I could not lift. But then I thought again about what legacy truly means. It is not always about being remembered by everyone. Sometimes it is about leaving pieces of yourself that matter, even if they are discovered later. I began to believe that maybe, even if my grandchildren didn't know me now, one day they might. Perhaps when they are grown, When they are curious about where they came from, they will stumble upon my journals, my recipes, my photographs. Perhaps then, for the first time, they will speak my name aloud. Margaret. And maybe it will mean something to them. The thought gave me a strange comfort. Even if they don't know me in life, maybe they will know me in memory. And maybe that is enough. I also started to notice something else. While my family might have forgotten my name, I had not forgotten theirs. Every prayer I whispered was filled with their names. Every birthday I remembered. Every holiday I thought of them. They lived inside me, whether or not I lived inside them. And that realization softened my fear just a little. Because in the end, love is not measured by how much it is returned, but by how deeply it is given. And my love had been deep, even if unseen. Still, I longed for just one moment of recognition while I was alive. Just once. I wanted one of my grandchildren to look at me and call me by name. Not lady, not ma'am, not dad's mom, but Grandma Margaret. I wanted to hear it, to hold it in my heart, to know that I was not invisible after all. Until that moment came, I chose to keep living with quiet dignity. I woke each morning, tended my garden, baked bread, sang in the choir, and wrote my stories. I carried my name with me, proud and unbroken, because even if no one else remembered it, I did. And I decided that was worth something. The fear of being forgotten still lingered like a shadow, but I began to make peace with it. Perhaps we are all forgotten in time, I thought. Perhaps names fade, stories slip away, and photographs gather dust. But while we are here, we have a choice. To live as if our lives matter, even if no one notices. And that is what I chose, to live fully, to love deeply, to carry my name proudly, even if I carried it alone. And in that choice, I found a strange kind of freedom. It was a cold winter afternoon when something happened that I will never forget. The snow had been falling steadily since morning, covering the world in a quiet blanket of white. I had just pulled a pan of rolls out of the oven when the phone rang. It was my daughter. She asked if she could stop by with the children for a short visit. My heart leapt the way it always did at such news, though I tried to answer calmly. "Of course," I said. "I'll put some cocoa on." Not long after, I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on snow outside my window. The door opened, and in tumbled my grandchildren, bundled in their coats and scarves, rosy-cheeked and full of chatter. They had grown so much since I'd last seen them, taller, older, their voices changing. Time has a way of rushing forward, like a river, whether we are ready or not. I greeted them warmly, hugging each one, though I noticed, as always, that they seemed shy, unsure what to call me. I had grown used to it by then. The sting was still there, but dulled by years of endurance. I smiled anyway, because love cannot wait for the perfect word. We sat together in the living room, the children sipping cocoa while I passed around the warm rolls. Their mother and I chatted about the weather, the school, and small matters of the day. The children sat quietly, flipping through one of the photo albums I had left on the table. And then it happened. My eldest granddaughter paused, her eyes fixed on a page. She leaned closer, tracing the handwriting I had carefully written beneath the photograph. Her small voice broke the silence. "Mom, who's Margaret?" My heart clenched, but before I could say anything, my daughter replied, "Sweetheart, that's your grandmother. That's her name." The girl looked up, her eyes wide, and turned toward me. She hesitated a moment, as if testing the sound on her tongue, then said softly, "Grandma Margaret?" I cannot explain to you what that moment felt like. It was as if a door long locked had suddenly swung open. The name I had carried all my life, the name I had whispered in the dark, The name I feared would be forgotten. It was spoken aloud, gently, reverently, by the very child I had longed to hear it from. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. "Yes, darling," I whispered. "That's me. I'm Grandma Margaret." The younger children looked up then, curiosity spreading across their faces. They began to say it too, as if tasting it for the first time. "Grandma Margaret," one said with a smile. "Grandma Margaret," echoed another, giggling as though the words themselves were new and exciting. I laughed through my tears, unable to contain the joy swelling in my chest. It was not the thunderous recognition I had once dreamed of. It was something quieter, more fragile, but it was real. For the first time, my name had found a place in their mouths, and in that moment, I knew it would also find a place in their memories. We spent the rest of that afternoon together in a way that felt different, almost sacred. The children asked me questions about the photographs, about the stories behind them. I told them about the old farmhouse where their father grew up, about the Christmas when the snowstorm knocked the power out, about the summers when the garden overflowed with tomatoes and we canned them together in the hot kitchen. Their laughter filled the room as I shared these pieces of the past, and each time one of them addressed me as Grandma Margaret, it was like a melody I had been waiting a lifetime to hear. That night, after they left, I sat by the window watching the snow continue to fall. The house was quiet again, but it felt less lonely. My name had been spoken, not by me into the darkness, but by the ones I feared would never know it. Even if they forgot again tomorrow, I would always carry the memory of that moment. It was enough to lift the shadow that had haunted me for so long. I realized then that legacy is not about monuments or fame, but about small, tender moments like that. It is about being present, leaving pieces of yourself behind, and trusting that love has a way of being discovered, even if it takes time. My grandchildren might not always remember every story, every recipe, or every detail, but they would remember that I loved them, and they would remember my name. As I sat there, I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. "Thank you, Lord, for letting me hear my name once more before I go." From that day forward, I no longer lived in fear of being forgotten. I had been remembered, and that memory would ripple outward, carried in the hearts of those I cherished most. Even if only in fragments, my story would live on. And when the day comes that I am no longer here, I trust that somewhere one of my grandchildren will look at a photograph, smile softly, and say, "That was my Grandma Margaret," and that will be enough.